The night of June 5, 1944, was not a quiet night, but an unnerving, expectant silence settled over the American airborne troops. It was a profound quiet born of shared fear and ultimate professional focus, defying the roar of the waiting C-47 engines. Hundreds of young men, heavily burdened with equipment, sat side by side in the cramped, dimly lit fuselages of the transport planes. Their gear, blackened faces, and steel helmets made them appear more like spectral warriors than boys from American towns. They knew this was the final, irreversible moment before plunging into the great unknown of Fortress Europe. The final words spoken were often not heroic pronouncements but quiet acknowledgments of the monumental task ahead. "This is it, boys," was a phrase repeated many times, a simple acceptance of destiny and duty. They shifted their weight constantly on the narrow metal benches, finding it impossible to fully relax under the heavy parachutes. The red jump light cast an ominous, arterial glow over the rows of waiting faces, a silent warning of danger to come. Many men preferred to stare at the rivets in the corrugated metal floor, avoiding the anxious eyes of their comrades. Every breath felt shallow, every beat of the heart felt loud, amplifying the internal psychological pressure of the moment. They were thinking of their mothers, their wives, or the life they had suspended back in the United States. The air inside the aircraft quickly grew thick with the smell of canvas, sweat, anti-flash grease, and strong pipe tobacco. Some of the veterans, the few who had already made combat jumps, tried to project a calm they did not truly feel. They shared their last cigarettes, a tiny ritual of comfort and shared vulnerability before the hell that awaited. The simple act of sharing a smoke became a final, profound expression of unit cohesion and brotherhood. The officers walked the line one last time, their movements deliberate and slow, their eyes sharp and reassuring. They offered simple, direct instructions, cutting through the anxiety with the clear certainty of the military objective. The low thrum of the engines became a psychological drumbeat, counting down the last precious minutes of safety. This silent waiting was the hardest part of the jump, a tense suspension before the violent, liberating action. They held their weapons tightly, finding a strange, cold comfort in the familiar weight of their combat rifle or submachine gun. The silence was a collective act of mental preparation, a necessary withdrawal into the deepest parts of their own resolve. They knew that once the doors opened and the green light flashed, the time for talking and thinking would be completely over. The heartfelt farewells exchanged were rarely complex sentences or flowery speeches, but simple, direct phrases carrying immense emotional weight. "See you on the ground" was the universal, most common phrase, embodying a promise and a fierce hope for survival. This statement was a defiant rejection of the high casualty forecasts and a belief in their own inevitable victory. Many men gave their friends small personal items, a cigarette lighter, a worn coin, or an extra piece of chocolate ration. These small tokens were a form of psychological insurance, ensuring that a piece of their identity would carry on. "Tell my folks I went down swinging, if it comes to that," was a common, stoic request given to a trusted partner. The responsibility of carrying a comrade's last message was accepted with a solemn nod and a heavy heart. They understood they were all stepping into a lottery of fate where chance would dictate who survived the drop. The men talked about the mundane things they would do when they returned, firmly rooting their minds in the future. One trooper might mention the hamburger and cold beer he was determined to have when they finally made it back to England. Another would talk about his plans to finish his college degree or finally marry his patient, waiting sweetheart. These shared, simple dreams were a psychological shield against the darkness and the fear of a permanent end. They would firmly slap one another on the shoulder, a physical expression of loyalty that transcended the need for words. The physical contact was a powerful, silent affirmation of their shared destiny and their commitment to fight side by side. Some men briefly showed their comrades a treasured photo of their family, a quick, proud glimpse of their reason for fighting. The sight of the loved ones was a powerful reminder that their mission extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. The phrase "take care of yourself, bud" was often heard, a sincere, heartfelt expression of mutual care and concern. They knew that their training could only carry them so far, and beyond that, they would be dependent on fate and each other. The final words spoken were an exercise in brevity, focusing on essential human connections and immediate necessity. There was an unspoken agreement to avoid any melodramatic or overly emotional language that could shatter the fragile composure. The true weight of their sacrifice and their love for one another resided in the powerful silences between the few words. Their farewells were a final act of human vulnerability before they were transformed into detached, combat-ready instruments. The airborne divisions were not just military units, they were deeply bonded families, forged in the intense, shared hardship of jump school. This powerful sense of brotherhood was their greatest comfort and their most profound source of courage in the dark airplane. They did not need extensive conversation to communicate their deepest anxieties or their absolute commitment to the mission. A simple look, a gesture, or a grunt was often enough to convey volumes of shared understanding and resolve. The men would check each other's equipment with meticulous care, their hands feeling for any loose buckle or faulty strap. This was a literal act of faith, trusting their life to the vigilance of the man standing immediately behind them. "How's my chute look?" was a standard question, asked with a nervous earnestness that demanded an honest, final appraisal. The response was almost always a firm, confident, tightly packed, "Sergeant," or "Good to go, Private," to maintain morale. They exchanged personal, inside jokes from training camp, the familiar humor briefly cutting through the oppressive anxiety. Laughter, even a nervous bark of it, was a temporary and essential release valve for the building's psychological pressure. The officers encouraged this camaraderie, knowing that a fractured unit would be utterly ineffective once scattered on the ground. One trooper would gently adjust the heavy main chute of the man in front of him, a non-verbal act of quiet support. They shared the last swigs of water from their canteens, ensuring every man was hydrated for the brutal exertion ahead. The phrase "don't forget the signal" was a serious reminder of the cricket clicker that would reunite them in the darkness. They made solemn promises to look for one another, pledging to rally at the designated objective or assembly point. The commitment to the man next to them was, in the end, a more tangible motivation than the abstract concept of patriotism. They knew they were jumping into chaos, and the only certainty was the absolute loyalty they held for their comrades. This deep trust meant that no man truly felt alone in the cramped, terrifying confines of the C-47 transport plane. The brotherhood was a psychological shield, protecting them from the personal terror of fighting an unseen enemy in the dark. Their unity was the invisible, powerful force that would allow them to reassemble into a fighting unit on the enemy's soil. They were bound together by their silk parachutes and their shared oath to either fight together or die trying. The senior commanders were keenly aware that their last words must be absolutely clear, concise, and powerfully inspiring. General Maxwell Taylor, the leader of the 101st Airborne Division, addressed his men with a steady, unflinching demeanor. His message was one of relentless aggression and an unyielding focus on the precise military objectives assigned to them. He reminded them that they were the spearhead, the first to touch down, and the men who would secure the entire invasion. "The success of the whole landing depends on you," was a phrase that hammered home the absolute, non-negotiable importance of their duty. He stressed the importance of immediate action upon landing, insisting they must not wait for others or become paralyzed by the chaos. They were told to fight with whatever they had, wherever they landed, and to immediately sow confusion among the German defenses. The general emphasized their superior training, assuring them that they were better equipped and more determined than any enemy they would face. "Move out and be swift and silent," was the tactical directive that served as the final word on their operational conduct. He made it clear that a scattered landing was inevitable, and that every individual man was expected to act as a self-contained unit. The paratroopers were instructed to ignore any confusion and press forward ruthlessly to their individual assigned bridges or crossings. His words instilled a deep sense of confidence, overriding the natural fear with a profound sense of military purpose and urgency. The commanders did not just send their men, they prepared to jump with them, sharing the very same and terrifying risk. This visible act of shared sacrifice was the single greatest morale booster, cementing the men's loyalty to their leaders. The soldiers carried the general's final, powerful words as a form of intellectual armament against the imminent battlefield terror. They understood they were not merely disposable decoys but the essential, active element that would crack open the German line. The final charge was a powerful, military blessing, releasing them from the final moment of waiting and into the action. The general's voice was the last sound of structured command they would hear before the roar of the jump took over their senses. They left the briefing area with a collective energy, transformed by the clarity of their mission and the certainty of their purpose. Humor was the airborne troopers' essential coping mechanism, a dark, self-deprecating tool for managing paralyzing, terminal fear. The jokes were often laced with a grim irony, acknowledging the immense danger while defiantly refusing to surrender to it. The men laughed at their own chances of survival, turning the morbid predictions into a form of collective, nervous energy. A legendary joke involved a trooper asking if the French had good-looking nurses, planning his own inevitable injury and subsequent recovery. The absurdity of planning a flirtatious hospital stay before even jumping was enough to elicit a deep, relieving belly laugh. They frequently made fun of their own cumbersome gear, joking that they were so heavy they would land without even needing a parachute. "If this chute doesn't open, I'm gonna be the first man to dig a foxhole with his head," a jittery trooper might declare. This defiant gallows humor was an act of psychological resistance, asserting a moment of control over the unpredictable hand of fate. The laughter was contagious, quickly spreading through the ranks as a necessary release of the tight, coiled tension in the aircraft. It was a crucial, final opportunity to be an ordinary American boy before the war demanded them to become cold-blooded killers. The officers were wise enough to encourage the levity, recognizing it as a key ingredient for maintaining group morale and sanity. They knew that a man who could still crack a joke was a man who still possessed the mental agility to fight and survive. Some men nervously fidgeted with their dog tags, rubbing the cold metal as they forced a smile at a comrade's quip. The jokes were always shared and never malicious, creating a final, warm bubble of shared humanity before the drop. They made bets with each other, wagering a few dollars or a week's worth of rations on who would be the first to reach the objective. This act of betting was a tangible expression of their confidence that they would all, in fact, survive to settle the score. The humor provided a temporary, necessary distraction from the terrifying sounds of the aircraft straining and the flak outside. It was the final, defiant noise they made before the silence of true combat professionalism took over their entire being. The laughter would vanish instantly when the jump master shouted, "He stand up," replaced by a stone-cold, predatory focus. Beneath the bravado and the jokes, the final moments were deeply personal for many, an urgent appeal to a higher power. The interior of the rattling CA-47 became a temporary sanctuary for hundreds of silent, individual acts of worship and reflection. Many soldiers, even those who were not routinely religious, found themselves seeking comfort in the familiarity of childhood prayers. They clutched their personal religious tokens, worn crucifixes, small prayer books, or metallic medallions from home. These small, cold objects were physical anchors to their faith and to the world of peace they were fighting to protect. The prayers were simple, direct, and uneloquent, focused intensely on two immediate needs: survival and courage. They asked for a clean jump, a chute that would open, and the strength to endure the brutal task that awaited them. One trooper was overheard quietly repeating a single phrase, "Help me do my job right," over and over again. This prayer acknowledged that success was not just about fate, but about the flawless execution of their military duty. The act of prayer was a profound psychological surrender, accepting that they had done all they could and the rest was up to God. It was a final, internal reckoning, a plea for forgiveness, and a moment to make peace with the possibility of immediate death. Many of the men mentally recited the 23rd Psalm, finding immense solace in the promises of protection within the valley of the shadow of death. The officers gave them complete privacy for this time, understanding the necessity of the spiritual preparation for the men's souls. This quiet period of introspection was an essential counterbalance to the external, deafening chaos of the approaching battlefield. They sought to reconcile the violence they were about to inflict with the moral principles they were fighting to uphold. The belief that their cause was just and righteous provided a crucial underpinning for their willingness to face such overwhelming danger. The fear in their stomach was addressed not by a man, but by a powerful, final act of faith in something larger than the war. They finished their prayers, mentally straightened their shoulders, and returned to their duty with a renewed, quiet sense of inner peace. The soldier and the man had briefly met, and the soldier was now ready to take his place at the gaping door of the aircraft. The shift from tense anticipation to active, terrifying reality occurred the moment the German anti-aircraft fire began to strike the aircraft. The sound was not a muffled thud but a sharp, unexpected clang of shrapnel tearing violently through the thin metal skin of the CA-47. This brutal, metallic noise instantly silenced the jokes and the prayers, replacing every other emotion with a white-hot combat focus. The aircraft would immediately shudder and buck violently as the pilots executed evasive maneuvers to avoid a catastrophic direct hit. Inside the cabin, the single red jump light would flicker erratically, heightening the sense of uncontrollable, blinding chaos. The troopers instinctively braced themselves, their hands gripping the jump struts or the sides of the fuselage for dear life. They were no longer in a safe transport, they were in a rapidly descending, metallic target flying through a wall of explosions. The smell of burning oil and the occasional acrid whiff of cordite from the flak explosions filtered into the cabin. Through the small portholes, men could catch glimpses of the French coastline, now illuminated by the terrifying, blossoming orange flares of anti-aircraft fire. The ground below was spitting fire at them, confirming their location and the extreme danger they were currently facing. The officers shouted over the deafening noise, their commands reduced to simple, insistent directives to maintain composure and position. The men's eyes, wide with adrenaline and terror, would flick from the flak explosions to the red jump light with desperate focus. Their training immediately took over, overriding the natural panic with the ingrained, repetitive commands of the jump process. The fear was instantly channeled into an aggressive determination to leave the lethal confinement of the airplane as quickly as possible. The collective thought was focused entirely on getting to the door, leaping out, and deploying the parachute to escape the flak zone. This brutal introduction to the Normandy battlefield was the final, irrevocable sign that the mission was fully underway. The men became acutely aware of the vulnerability of their position, suspended in a slow-moving, flammable metal tube. This sudden crescendo of noise and violence completed their transformation from men waiting to men in immediate, active combat. The challenge and reply system was one of the most critical and whispered communications exchanged by the paratroopers before the jump. This system was an absolute necessity for survival on the ground, designed to prevent them from shooting their own comrades in the dark. Every man carried a small, brass cricket clicker, a simple toy that would provide their unique and secret password in the blackness. The metallic click-clack of the cricket was the only reliable way to distinguish a fellow American from a lurking German patrol. The code was constantly changed, but the primary system for the initial D-Day jump was the challenge, flash, followed by the reply, thunder. Many troopers quietly practiced the rhythm of the clicks, ensuring the tiny piece of brass worked flawlessly under pressure. They reminded each other of the proper use of the code, knowing that a mistake could be immediately fatal upon landing. 2 clicks, wait, then 3 clicks, an officer might quietly instruct the men, drilling the pattern into their minds one last time. The men understood that silence after the challenge was not an absence of sound but a deadly confirmation of an enemy presence. They made solemn promises to listen with absolute intent for the distinctive sound of the clicker in the bewildering French night. The clicker was a symbol of their unity, a tiny, fragile instrument that would reassemble a scattered army in the deep darkness. It was a final piece of practical, crucial information shared in the plane, superseding all other sentimental or personal talk. The seriousness of the signal was emphasized over every other order, underscoring the friendly fire danger in the chaos. They pictured themselves in the dark, calling out the challenge, their heart pounding as they waited for the correct, saving reply. This quiet focus on the code was another form of distraction from the terror, grounding their minds in a concrete, actionable task. The cricket clicker became a powerful talisman, their small, mechanical passport to safety and reunion in the hostile fields. They tucked the brass toy into a secure, easily reachable pocket, knowing its small sound was worth more than a full clip of ammunition. The jump master was the living, breathing manifestation of the final, critical push, the absolute master of the jump sequence. His voice was a necessary, unyielding sound that cut through the noise of the plane and the fear in the men's minds. Stand up and hook up was the first command, a loud, non-negotiable order that transformed the men from passive riders into active jumpers. The men responded with an immediate, practiced, collective stagger, hooking their static lines to the anchor cable above their heads. The jump master moved quickly, his eyes darting to check every single static line attachment, searching for any sign of a potentially fatal mistake. His hands were rough and firm, slapping the men's shoulders to ensure they were alert and properly secured to the aircraft. Check your equipment was the next demand, prompting the rhythmic sound of hands slapping reserve chutes and harnesses down the line. His relentless, focused energy was a psychological buoy, preventing the men from succumbing to panic at the open door. The red jump light was now on, bathing the exit in a warm, ominous glow, signaling their imminent arrival over the drop zone. The jump master would shout, "Get ready," a sharp, final verbal alert before the irreversible order to exit the plane. This was the ultimate moment of decision, where the entire mission contracted to the small, terrifying gap of the C-47's door. He waited for the signal from the pilot, his eyes fixed on the lights, holding the lives and the mission of his men in the palm of his hand. The moment the light turned green, his voice became a terrifying, explosive shout, "Go," followed by a powerful, physical push. He immediately began the practiced count: 1, 2, 3. For ensuring the flow of men was fast, smooth, and relentless. His hands pushed them out, one after another, an unfeeling, professional force of gravity and military necessity. The jump master's voice was the last sound of sanity and order the paratroopers would hear before the roar of the wind took over. As the troopers shuffled and lunged for the open door, their final utterances were powerful, abbreviated articulations of their American spirit. The iconic shout of Geronimo was the common battle cry, a word of shared defiance that had become the anthem of the airborne. It was an explosive vocal release, the last piece of civilian exuberance before the cold professionalism of combat took hold. Other final shouts were more personal, simple words that spoke to their resolve and their purpose in the foreign sky. For Mom, Ors for the States, were powerful, short statements that encapsulated their entire reason for being over Normandy. One soldier was heard to yell, "See you in Berlin," a bombastic, confident vow of total victory and enduring survival. This bravado was a necessary psychological armor, a final, public declaration of their unshakable belief in their own success. They carried the weight of the entire American democracy on their backs, and their final words were a testament to that burden. A quiet vow was often a simple prayer, "Lord, let me land safe," whispered under the roar of the engines and the shouting. The final words were a culmination of everything they had been trained to be: brave, resolute, and ultimately aggressive. They were focused on the task, but their heart was still full of the love for the country and people they were defending. The sound of their voices, quickly lost to the wind and the engine noise, was the final sound of America hitting the skies of Europe. Their vows were a commitment to fight relentlessly, a promise to their comrades to never yield until the mission was complete. The very act of yelling into the wind was a conscious rejection of fear, a final act of human agency before the fall. They were leaping into the darkness as the vanguard of the liberation, and their final shouts were the first sounds of freedom. Beyond the emotional farewells, the most common final words were strictly practical and focused on immediate survival and military necessity. The men continuously reminded each other to maintain their distance in the jump stream to avoid a mid-air collision. "Keep a tight count," was a shouted reminder to the man in front to maintain the required interval between the jumpers. They reminded one another about the proper landing procedure, drilling the parachute landing fall into their minds one last time. "Keep your knees bent," was a crucial, last-second piece of advice shouted from a veteran to a young, nervous recruit. This simple command was essential for avoiding a crippling ankle injury upon impact in the unknown, dark terrain. They ensured their weapon quick-release lanyard was not tangled in their gear, preventing the loss of their rifle upon deployment. "Knife ready" was a directive to ensure their fighting knife was immediately accessible for cutting away entangling parachute lines. The men frequently checked their pockets for the small, metal cricket clicker, their indispensable tool for identifying friendlies. The practical focus was a highly trained military reflex, allowing them to channel their fear into immediate, useful action. They made sure their leg bags, containing heavy supplies, were properly secured for the violent opening shock of the parachute. The constant repetition of these simple, life-saving instructions was the final, necessary mental conditioning for the brutal combat drop. They were focused on the mechanics of their equipment, knowing that the smallest human error could have catastrophic consequences. The final words were a testament to their rigorous training, overriding the sentimentality with cold, absolute military precision. This practical exchange was the ultimate sign of their professionalism, their deep commitment to surviving the jump flawlessly. The very last sound exchange between the paratroopers was often an inarticulate grunt of exertion as they were pushed out the door. This grunt was the final, immediate reaction to the overwhelming rush of the wind and the terrifying leap into the abyss. Once out, the words were instantly silenced by the roar of the slipstream, replaced by the profound, rushing sound of their own descent. They were suspended in a momentary sensory deprivation, their world reduced to the wind and the frantic hope for the parachute's opening. The only word that mattered now was the unspoken, silent crack of the canopy deploying high above their head. That sound, when it came, was the sweetest sound in the world, the promise of a fighting chance for survival. If the chute failed, the rushing wind became a deafening, terrifying roar, the last, solitary sound of their plummeting fall. The men in the air immediately went silent, their training taking over as they scanned the sky for danger and the ground for landmarks. The mission was no longer about the words spoken in the plane, but about the silent, relentless execution of their primary objective. They became isolated, dangling figures, quickly dispersed by the wind, each man an island of American resolve in the dark. Their last thoughts were pure, immediate tactics: cut away the leg bag, look for the assembly point, and locate the nearest comrade. The silence of their descent was a necessary act of stealth, a final commitment to the surprise and chaos of the night drop. The words of brotherhood, prayer, and humor were finished, replaced by the brutal, solitary focus of the combat soldier. They were the first wave, the angels of the sky, plunging into the darkness to secure the vital, narrow beachhead of the invasion. Their ultimate commitment to their country and their comrades had propelled them from the safety of England into the deadly unknown of Normandy.